gonna rank the albums now.
I'm making this video with a perhaps surprising lack of a plus sign. Grandaddy's career blends perfectly into Jason's solo work, and they even have an Alias album and a couple more things I could arguably include. Really, it's closer to having a minus sign due to this Bandcamp full of extra full lengths you can immediately throw online these days. Two of these are compilations of reduced solo versions of tracks, which is kind of what I've done 1,000 times on YouTube, but Jason's simple musicianship and squeak toy voice don't gain from being presented naked. And then there's this site. It feels like the bounty of Grandaddy's obscure content offers a separate plot to just ranking the albums. It's not all about maximal availability, though it has been put on this very generous, bounteous fan archive. I'm not buying one of the world's 10 CD copies of this arguable first album, but it can be streamed on the superhighway. This album EP thingy is before it, just a bit too scrappy to rank seriously. Mainly, you won't be prepared for its sound. I said something really clever in the filmed bit that I'm about to undermine by saying this, but Grandaddy grew from Californian skateboard punk rock, and you can hear that here. Mostly the punk rock, not so much of the growing from it. Grandaddy went on to be the very best band at the style they kind of founded, with some help from Pavement, Flaming Lips, Weaker Thans, but you can call this a charming prequel. This means that when they do break out into hardcore punk for about 2 minutes per hour, it feels very silly and sarcastic, but that oddly doesn't undermine it. They use it as a guest character. Gathering Tape is too scrappy to weigh up, so before we get physical, this finds them along the path from punk rock to the sound they establish, but the good tracks on this are on a later thing I'll get to. Here's another title for another near unfindable release. Less interesting in itself, this is where the dodgy tuning doesn't feel like an asset. So here are the ones you can reasonably get copies of. I'm going to start out with an EP's compilation. It's inherently scrappy, but that's very directly part of their vibe, as I've probably already described in the bit I've not yet recorded. The thing to realize with Grandaddy is that they're actually post-punk, but the punk that they are post is Californian punk. Maybe every punk gets its own post. This is a band who have all their instincts from that scene, they're just not using them in the same way. In some senses, they're inverting them with a much quieter sound, very soft vocals. But in some of their musical structure, they also play it straight. They have all the downstrokes, chopping power chords as well. And that's a very compelling combination here. Let me decide later whether I include this in the stack. Yeah, go on. It's not that great itself, but it's still a fine listen. It's fine. There's a slightly better, if less ethical, version of that compilation. Straight up albums, by most people's understanding, this is where this list would start. And it thereby has the vibe of a fully planned album with some massive singles on it. And they are a kind of massive, just using Grandaddy's own smallness, going massive within that. It's great to hear them commit to a full album project. There's just a few hairy parts they could have sorted out, and they're gonna outclass this a few times on the remaining albums. Then an EP that functions as a wintry prelude to their best work, spoiler. And that's kind of all it is. It's very brief, it's inessential in its own content, but it's a good to great set of 4 extra tracks that you can consider in comparison to this one. Because here we go, they've directly referenced sophomore slumping, and they've done the inverse. They've sophomore shone. This focuses the character of Grandaddy and how they talk about technology, but from a very naturalist standpoint. The strength of that vibe somewhat makes it a concept album, but to a similar extent they're a concept band. But concept has nothing on content, and this album is great in its content. It's amazing what they can do with such simple elements, quite basic musicianship, often just like major key scales as the melodies. One finger synth lines, guitar chords without many extra notes to them, but no one else has made so much from so little. Within that punkish simplicity, Grandaddy have found a unique beauty, and it's best expressed on this album. I know this stack doesn't have everything in it. Another nearly unfindable set where each copy's textual cover was handwritten. It's definably cast-offs, but it's really good. It shows that Grandaddy's brilliance isn't all in the studio finish, but it's evident enough in their basic approach to music. This is another title for a collection of songs, B-sides thrown together, but nothing interesting. Then to follow up something so sweeping, so majestic, the right option is to make an album of bullet point pop songs where they could be singles in their own rights. That's what we've got on here, 12 tracks, each with their own separate beauty. The thing that holds this one down is its quite sedated pace. It's sleepy pop, and that might come across as a feature to many. It's somewhat a feature, but I believe it's also a bit of a detriment. By only rocking out in track 1, and even then only just rocking out, they leave us waiting for a resurgence that doesn't come. Still, the quality of the songs places it here. Now, an EP that's definitely eligible for inclusion. I think it's over half an hour long. You could just call that an album. The title suggests a concept EP from the point of view of a douche. He's not exactly committed to that concept, but he didn't need to because the music's so good. Not only is this Grandaddy at their best, but it's a new kind of best. Jason's found a way to return to the concept album vibe of Software without repeating on himself. So it's a new way to be almost as good at this, just held down by brevity and just not being the absolute genius of this one. It's testament to the quality of this band that something so good can be a forgettable cast-off. The definition of bandhood is difficult to keep track of because Jason might have been the only musician on this. Did he have a drummer? Might also be true of Todzilla. Screw the technicalities, it's published under the name Grandaddy, and this is another album of them at their best. And despite the reduced person power, there's room to rock out more in this. Even though this is the band petering out, and that's one of its features, it also sounds like how they could have and should have gone on, and did, because it's recorded. Now they're embracing a wider scope. Their established concept album was made of bite-sized songs. Here's one made of outsized songs, and not to its detriment at all. They all earn their breadth, and they each have their own adventure. I feel this one's underappreciated. I feel it's another example of Grandaddy at their very best, and it might even compete for the top position, if not for some time wasted on a couple of tracks that just don't work as well. As far as studio albums go, it's a funny definition to break up when your most recent album just had the one musician on it, and then to reunite with an album that still only has that one musician on it. There's no practical distinction between this and his actual solo work, but there's a nominative distinction. He clearly intends it that way, and that's how I've chosen to confront this discography. As far as a band, as a brand goes, this is a long-awaited comeback, and it's kind of perfunctory. It's got a first side that makes you smile and go, yeah, Grandaddy are living up to expectations on their return, exactly that and nothing more. And then a kind of poxy, dull, pointless second side. It's a feeble comeback in total. It's difficult to know how to calibrate a comeback, as this album could tell fans, I'm exactly what you wanted. And it's likable enough for a few tracks, but I also wanted to be impressed. Nominative determinism. It feels unfair to respond to an adequate comeback like this, but I really dislike the blunt-ass sequel song. Don't do that. The rest of it's worth your time, as is this whole stack. I did a lot of listening and assessing prep for this video, and can basically conclude that things that are not in the stack and not replays can generally go somewhere around the Comforter collection as a low-profile but good quality music, wandering before finding the trajectory of their band concept.